Dear listeners, I'm Adrian Matus, editor at the Review of Democracy, and your host today. I would like to welcome you to our series of live events organized by the Democracy and Culture section. Throughout these events, our aim is straightforward. We want to map the latest cultural and academic debates. Today, we're focusing on an extremely timely edited volume with the title Negotiating Invisibility: Women, Science, Engineering and Medicine in the 20th Century, edited by Amelia Bona and Irina Nastase Matei, and published by Manchester University Press this year. We are truly honored to host both editors, Amelia Bonia and Irina Nastase Matei, along with two distinguished respondents, Katia Dose and Rachel Cowan. Let me briefly introduce the guests. Amelia Bonia is a lecturer in Global History of Science, Technology and Medicine in the Center for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine, University of Manchester. Her current work examines the global entanglements of earth and environmental sciences in South and East Asia in the 20th century and the role of women therein. Irina Nastase Matei is a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences, University of Bucharest. Irina is a historian and political scientist working on transnational networks of education and science exchange, especially in the context of authoritarian regimes. For today's event, the respondents will be Katia Dose, who is a senior researcher in the Department of Geosciences at the University of Freiburg, and Rachel Cowan, who is a professor at the Manchester School of Medicine at the University of Manchester. Let me walk you through the structure of our today's live event. First, our editors will introduce the book. This will take about 12 minutes in total. Then, our respondents will share their thoughts, reflections, and comments. Afterwards, the editors will have the chance to respond, and finally, we'll open the floor to your questions in the chat section of our YouTube channel. I will gather the questions and address them to our guests. Our talk about negotiating invisibility, women, science, engineering, and medicine in the 20th century will begin with Irina Nastase Matei. Irina, you have the word.
Thank you, Adrian, very much for organizing this book talk, and thank you very much, Katia and Rachel, for agreeing to comment on it. The idea for this volume started from a simple but very important question. How is it that women have been so present throughout the history of science? And also, as Mariko Ogawa argues in the foreword, that the 20th century was a century for women in science. And how come they are yet so invisible in the stories we tell about science, in the mainstream history of science, in encyclopedias and textbooks? All of us involved in this project came from very different fields: history of science, history of medicine and technology, history of education, organizational history, or gender studies. And also the area of expertise of all the authors range from the early 20th century to the interwar period to the Cold War. And we also have more contemporary reflections. But all the authors were united in the same concern: to understand the mechanisms of invisibility in science. We were interested in recovering forgotten women and bring to light stories that have not yet been told or fully told. But we also wanted to examine how professional recognition is constructed, who gets to speak in the name of science, and how visibility and prestige are distributed within academic worlds. The book gathers contributions from very diverse contexts, from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, United States, as well as Asia. And this diversity is precisely what makes it so compelling. The chapters explore women scientists navigating institutions dominated by men, women engineers defining their professional identities in socialist regimes, women in science and technology who create alternative professional networks to remain active in both their profession and in society, women doctors who use the press and public health education as alternative spaces of professional expression when traditional scientific arenas were closed to them, as well as women who constantly negotiated between traditional domestic roles and professional aspirations, and who often innovated scientifically from within those traditional positions. Across all these stories, invisibility does not mean absence. It is a historical process of negotiation. Women found strategies, networks, and languages through which to carve out space, assert expertise, and transform institutions from within. For us, as the editors, working on this volume, and together with the authors who authored the chapters, working on this volume was more than an academic exercise. It was an experience of collaboration, solidarity, and mutual learning. In a way, it mirrored the themes of the book itself: how we negotiate visibility, how we collaborate, and how we support one another within the academic life. This is why the core message of the book is very timely, we think. It speaks about who has and who is granted visibility, about how expertise is recognized, and about which forms of knowledge are deemed legitimate. These are not questions only about the past. They also speak directly to our present, about how we work, how we publish, and how recognition circulates in the scientific world yesterday and today. As also the title indicates, Negotiating Invisibility, the volume is not about absence, as I already mentioned. It is about negotiation, about the processes through which women, some of them marginalized not only by gender, but also by their ethnicity, social status, migration status, marital status, age, urban or rural background, geographic origin, or in the case of the India by caste, for example, and also more, created spaces for themselves, sometimes outside institutions, sometimes at the margins of the institutions, and sometimes even within these institutions. So we hope that the volume serves as an invitation to dialogue, to reflection, and especially to continuing this line of research. And we also hope that readers will find it not only in this volume, not only stories from the past, but also questions for the present and for the future, about how we recognize work and how women can be solidary in this endeavor. So thank you very much for inviting us here, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much for a very clear and very straightforward presentation. I would like to give the word to Amelia Bonia, the second editor, to present her thoughts.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for organizing this book presentation, as well as Rachel and Katia for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us today. Books, especially open access books, cannot be published without financial and institutional assistance. So I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of the German Research Council, who funded the conference on which the volume is based and which Katia attended. Through my individual research grant, Archives of the Earth, Fossil Science and Historical Imaginaries in 20th Century India, as well as the John Rylands Research Institute and Library at the University of Manchester, who decided to go against the norm and fund the open access publication of an edited volume. And finally, Manchester University Press for being the best publisher we could have asked for, and for standing by us even when we insisted that we wanted to publish a book that was a bit different from the norm, as Irina has already pointed out. So if I was asked to tell in very few words what we wanted to achieve by publishing this volume, it would be exactly this. We wanted to write a book that challenged both research conventions and publication conventions about women in global STEM fields. And I would like to emphasize on both counts that this involved a lot of work, as it usually is when you are doing research or work in more than one language. And if we count them all, we probably have around 10 languages in this book, which, as you can imagine, is a challenge from an editorial, but also copy editing perspective. But I like to think that Irina and I were well placed to take on this challenge because we were already accustomed to operating in several languages, so Romanian, German, English, and probably other languages I don't know about in Irina's case, and English, Japanese, Romanian, German, and some Hindi in my case. So this volume is in many ways an extension of work we have been doing for a long time. And if I was to pinpoint my own particular contribution to it, it would probably be the unusual combination of geographies that is reflected in the case studies and might come as a surprise to some, but feels very natural to me as an Eastern European trained for a long time in Asian area studies at institutions of education in Japan and Germany. So I think it was this educational background that made me, and also after I met Irina, when we discussed, made us more aware of the gaps in previous research. For example, the fact that when we talk about transcultural interactions between Asia and Europe, what we usually mean is interactions between a handful of countries in Western Europe and an Asia that is equally ill-defined. Or we ignore many other possible configurations of research, such as scientific exchanges between Asian countries or between countries in Asia and Eastern Europe or between countries in Asia and Africa. So it's a very ambitious research agenda, and this book only scratches the surface. But what I wish to emphasize in this connection is that bringing these case studies together between the covers of one volume wasn't a box-ticking exercise for us. We did it because we genuinely believe that a history of science that focuses only on one area of the world can only be an incomplete history of science at best, in the same way that a history of science that ignores the contributions of self-identifying women also is. So it's relatively easy to have illusions of grandeur, as I like to call them, in science and beyond, when you're only focusing on one small area of the world and don't know what happens somewhere else. Say, for example, when we insist on talking about national science, right? Ignoring the fact that in most, if not all cases, knowledge emerges out of interactions between people and ideas and systems of knowledge situated in different parts of the world. And of course, this is not to say that those exchanges are not circumscribed by power hierarchies. And I think the world of academic publishing, as we know it today, might be a good example of how some of those power hierarchies still survive and function. And similarly, it's easy to have illusions of grandeur in science when you're only studying half of the world's population, ignoring what the other half has been doing. So for us, as Irina has already pointed out, the challenge was not to demonstrate that women had been present in STEM in the 20th century. We already knew they had been there. And we discussed this topic in more detail in the introduction, for example, when we talk about numbers and what we call the politics of invisibility in STEM. But the challenge was to understand how they exercise agency and how they navigated their circumstances, often using visibility and invisibility as a tool. So in other words, is the difference between being present in science and exercising agency in science. And it's a distinction I personally was inspired to think about more seriously after reading the work of Malayali historian and feminist Jay Devika, with whom I had the pleasure of collaborating on a different project. And I can only hope that others will be inspired in the same way by our volume, and that it will encourage them to read things and perhaps write differently about the history of women in STEM fields. And with this, I thank you very much for gathering today, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, it's a pleasure to discuss about this extremely important volume. As you mentioned, again, the linguistic and the geographical diversity, it's an extremely strong point of this book. We have 3 chapters that focus on India, 2 on China, 1 on Romania, 1 on Hungary, 1 on Czech Republic, 1 on Greece, 2 on UK, and 3 on the US. I hope I covered all the topics. Again, this shows the broad ambition. And again, the concept of invisibility, I'm sure that we will discuss it a bit later on. Before that, I would like to give the word to Rachel, who would provide her comments and insights and reflections on this book.
Thank you so much. So firstly, I'd really like to thank Amelia and Irene and the authors within the chapters in this book. It was so thought-provoking, engaging, and impactful for me. I was completely absorbed as the stories of invisible women were revealed and contextualized in the historical, legal, political, educational, and cultural norms of their times. The book felt deeply personal for me. It prompted deep reflection on my own scientific journey. You know, I started that in the 20th century, in the late 1980s. You know, I could access higher education and take a degree in biochemistry because of the educational reforms in the UK. But when I got to university, I quickly realized that there were very few women, even at the junior level in my faculty, and absolutely none at the senior higher education leader level. So books obviously have been published before documenting individual women's STEM careers or the hidden contribution of women in a specific discipline or from a specific institution, usually in the West. The impact of the two world wars on women's increased participation in STEM fields has also been well researched and documented. But this really is the first time that I've seen such a comprehensive historical perspective being taken across a whole century. You know, it's bringing diverse women from underrepresented countries to really give a global perspective on this subject, and all in one book. So I am the senior leader responsible for accelerated gender equality progress in my own institution. So as I was reading the book, I was really hoping to be able to draw out learning and insights into the actions that I can take along with others, and for that to be really informed by the experiences of women in the past. And I was not disappointed. You know, I really valued reading the stories of these brave, resilient women and, you know, how they drew on advocacy and friendship and solidarity with other women to move forward together. So what I'd like to focus in on are some of the key themes that emerge for me within the book. And the first is around access to higher education and progression through a STEM career. So the stories really highlighted to me how relatively recently women have been able to access higher education and STEM careers. It really explored and highlighted to me how enduring narratives have been presented about women and how they are not cut out to be scientists. You know, things were said in some of the stories around them being a distraction for men, taking up valuable space, being wasted in a laboratory because they would soon marry and have children. And even for women who could gain access, they often faced very challenging cultural environments in which to study and work. The women experienced overt discrimination and antisocial behaviour. Derogatory, marginalising terms were, you know, put onto those women. You know, they were termed unsexed, a neuter, a refrigerated woman. And these terms were across different cultures, which I'd never realised before. They were really, you know, base attempts were used to really de-scientize these women by focusing on non-scientific attributes, such as body shaming, even notable women such as Rosalind Franklin. I was also inspired by how these women were pragmatic and really worked within the STEM culture and systems of their time and progressed their careers despite these challenges, finding clever ways through. So many of the women struggled to get tenure and had to pursue their careers within job families that were deemed more suitable for women at the time, in research administration, as technicians, in teaching roles. And I am fascinated by and currently exploring gendered spaces in academia. And so it really resonated with me. And when I analyse workforce data today in higher education and STEM careers, I see the same things happening. I see women being more likely to be on fixed term contracts in teaching and administrative roles. We also see through the book that women were only allowed into some STEM disciplines, but not others. The book celebrates the contribution that women have made to nursing and women's health research, but also highlights the resistance that women such as Lynn Sagan experienced as a theoretical evolutionary scientist. Her male peers questioned her very credibility as a scientist, the originality of her work, positioning her research as strange, and were even as blunt as to openly call her research crap. Her theoretical biology paper was rejected by a dozen journals. But rather than be cowed by this, Lynn seemed to relish in the challenge and became more outspoken, and so was consequently branded a rebel. But she kept going, possibly emboldened by the increasing numbers of STEM women by the time she, in the 1960s and 1970s. We see the same thing today, where women face a double bind as research leaders and leaders generally in higher education. They're criticised if they're too feminine or emotional, which is positioned in opposition for them to be objective scientists, or in Lynn's case, criticised for channeling masculine traits when this is not seen as acceptable for a woman. I particularly welcome the stories from India, Iraq, and China, which are so underrepresented in the literature, and to really see these women outside of Western contexts being profiled. The story of Janaki Amal, a botanist and first ever woman ever anywhere to be appointed to a professorship in an all-men's college of science in India, was inspiring. And it was even more gratifying to read that she was able to use her position to open doors for other women scientists and her longtime international collaborator and friend, the American scientist Eileen Erlandson. In fact, that was a common thread for many of the women profiled. They received mentorship, advocacy, and support to bolster and sustain their scientific practice and careers, and they in turn returned the favour and did the same for others. This was either as part of a scientific couple, or through close female allyship or advocacy from political leaders in their countries. This was achieved either formally or informally through networks, through international conference attendance, and by forming and joining international women's societies. I was fascinated by the evolution of these collaborative societies, which often grew from national level women scientist and engineer networks into transnational societies that were even able to bring people together from east to west, even during the Cold War. Individually and as part of these networks, many of the women in STEM that were profiled became politically active, advocating for their place as scientists, but going further in advocating for women's rights more generally, and also for wider social reform, including for racial equality and for world peace. Finally, perhaps my favourite chapter focused on Clara Park, who was an outsider, a humanities scholar, but who made a significant contribution to autism research, motivated by her experiences as a mother, parenting for her autistic daughter. This chapter shows the evolving value placed on lived experience and narratives from non-academic sources, bringing new ways of constructing scientific knowledge. This resonates today in my field, where the scientific method prioritizes patient public involvement and engagement in research. My final reflections are all of these women are inspiring. They showed persistence and bravery. And we see through the book that they achieved this progress through their own efforts, but this was only made possible by the equality rights progress going in tandem with educational reform and a positive public discourse and government support for diverse STEM research, education and careers. So my questions for Amelia and Irene, which of the stories resonated most with you and why? And if we were to fast forward 75 years from now, what will the history of women in STEM in the 21st century be? Which women will be celebrated and who will be hidden? And what can I do as an equalities leader to avoid hidden histories such as these?
Thank you very much for the very meaningful questions. I would like to give now the word to Katia Dose.
Thank you, Adrian. And also thank you to Amelia and Irina for inviting me. To give me the honor to be the discussant of your book. That's really great. And as Amelia already said, I was part of the initial conference from which this volume emerged. So it is even a bigger pleasure to me to join this conversation and to see, what happened, what came out of this conference. And it is really, really very rich and ambitious work. And I'm very excited to be part of this process to the end of it. So yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity. And as Adrian has already presented me, so I come to this book as a historian of science and a historian of the environment. I work mostly on Central Eastern Europe. I work now on Central Asia, so on the Soviet periphery. So all of these are regions that were numerically very present in the STEM, where women were very present in STEM. But yet often they remain strangely absent from our historiographies, as is also mentioned in the foreword and in some of the contributions. And the one thing I deeply, and I will come to other points as well, but the one thing I deeply appreciated about this volume was its focus on solidarity among the female networks, because I think this is really something we don't speak a lot about, because I think we know a lot about the male networks and about how impermeable they are for women to enter, which is why their careers are usually hampered and so forth. So I think this was really something I enjoyed very much reading, because I think we should focus much more on that. Then there are other three aspects that stood out to me in particular. And some of these things I've already mentioned by Rachel, so I'm very sorry if I'm doubling that. But maybe that just speaks for our similar appreciation of that volume. So first, the book powerfully dismantles the idea that visibility follows numbers. And I think this is especially true for all the case studies that play in regions where women are much more visible in the STEM fields. Like in socialist Eastern Europe, in Romania, in China, and in some parts in India, where they often vanish from institutional memory, public imaginaries, and standard historiographies, despite the fact of being very present. And so this book shows that visibility is not a demographic phenomenon, but a function of power. And secondly, and I think here I've also joined Rachel again, I really value this multi-sided approach you take, because a lot of studies, I think so far, they center a lot on laboratories and the Academy of Sciences and these very official institutionalized places. And but here it appears in secondary school classrooms in Romania and missionary hospitals in China and small clinics in Baghdad. In kitchens and as Rachel was talking about the case study of the mother who's writing about her children. So and this is science in the making, and I think these very daily sort of acts of science in the home, in the domestic scene, or in the school scene. I mean, this really shifts our idea of what science actually was in different periods, and it separates this idea of what is actually the real science from auxiliary or domestic practices, and opens this field. And third, here again, I join Rachel, the geographic spread of this book is genuinely impressive. And I mean, Amela, you just mentioned the process of it. I can't even imagine this. To have to work with people from so many different cultural backgrounds, with so many different academic backgrounds, different ideas and concepts of what gender is, of what role the concept of gender in the historical context is. And this is really impressive also because it is, as you said, it's very rare to have these regions all combined, because even if you look at standard handbooks on the history of science, I mean, yes, we have the classic countries in there, the classic case studies, but this is really a very fascinating array of diversity, which I think helps us, pushes us to think of science through the polycentric, so rather than the center peripheral framework, but we also start to think of other networks between countries that we didn't think about before. So let me now turn to a few questions that emerged from me, and I had a lot of questions, not because I didn't like it, but because it was really thought-provoking for me, especially because it's very, very close to my own research. And so I hope these questions can open conversations about the contribution of this book, but also, and I was hoping we could do this all together to think a bit more forward of, a little bit like what Rachel was asking, if you turn the 75 years ahead, but I was more thinking in terms of as the field, like where can our field, the gendered history of science actually go, and how can this book help us? So my first question is, and Adrian has already mentioned that in his introduction, we may discuss the concept of invisibility a bit more. So your central category is this invisibility, and I find it very evocative. And the book makes it very clear that this invisibility could be imposed, but at some times that it was also sort of chosen or strategically embraced by the actors for survival, for autonomy, simply as a response to hostile institutions. There were very different ideas in these different case studies. But at the same time, many women in your book, they had no room for negotiation. So, and we talked about agency already at some point in the introductory words. The invisibility was structured, not chosen. So I was wondering, I mean, I'm sure you reflected about this when writing the introduction, when working together with the different authors. How did you work through this tension when shaping the volume? So when does this concept of negotiating invisibility illuminates the historical dynamics at play? And when might it maybe risk suggesting forms of agency that actually were not available to the women you discussed? So how did you manage this this tension between these very oppositionary positions? And the second question aims more towards the future of gender history of science. As Rachel has mentioned, your book sits in a very rich and important traditions of collections that recover women's lives in science. And your book does so exceptionally well because it has a range of case studies and geography spread, which I've already mentioned in the beginning. But many of us, and including myself, or maybe just myself, I don't know, we can see that in the discussion, find ourselves wondering, where does this field go from here? Yeah. So how do we move beyond this model of case study? Yeah. How can we make this more into something more coherent and transferable to something more theoretical? What would it take for gender and power to become constitutive of the history of science? Not a specialized subfield, not an add-on, yeah, but sort of part of the main narrative. So in other words, how do you write histories in which women, gender, and structural inequalities appear not as a supplement, but as something very foundational to how science is actually made, circulated, and remembered? And so I was just wondering what your ideas were. I mean, you worked intensively on this now, working with all these authors, proofreading. So how you imagine this next step forward from there on? And the third question, is more about the high female participation, but the low historiographic visibility, which I think speaks very much to my own research, working on Central Asia, working on the Soviet Union, on former communist regimes. And I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned that, and some of the case studies also mentioned the fact that there are the hidden archives, there's a problem of fragmented archives and so forth. But so if we speak about these countries where the visibility was actually there, but these women are still missing from the general gendered historiography of science, why is that? Like, what, from your perspective now that you work through all these different case studies, like, what is this reason for that? And the very last question, and then I'm finished. A very last question, and maybe this is also connects to Rachel. But in terms of teaching and integration, this is something I think about a lot. Actually, this semester I'm teaching an introductory course to the history of science in Lyon. And again, I caught myself having one session called Gendered History of Science. And actually, I told myself I don't want to do this again, but then I just took the same seminar I already did. And so, but for the next coming semesters, I really want to look at a more integrated approach, like not to do this add-on, but to make it more integrated into our general studies of history of science. And I was wondering, what should we change, or what is your advice? What's your take on, what did you take from work on this book on teaching? How can we reach the students and also our colleagues? It's not only about students, it's also about our history colleagues, right? To implement that, or to integrate our views and our research, our very valuable research to this. And so yes, I as I said, I'm very I have many more questions, and maybe we can discuss them later or during the discussion round. And so yeah, thank you very much, and I'm looking very much forward to questions and our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Now the editors have the word, and I would like to give the word first to Amelia and then to Irina.
Well, thank you very much for these very generous comments and thought-provoking questions. I don't know if I will be able to address all of them. I tried to take notes, but I might have forgotten some of them. So hopefully I managed to capture some general themes that will answer most of the questions. But really, the first thing I would like to say regarding, what will happen in 75 years from now on is something that we wrote in the acknowledgements. I hope we don't have these discussions anymore. The problem is obsolete, irrelevant. We do not have to engage. It's been solved, and we don't have to. That's my genuine hope. Now, as a historian, I'm also aware that that will probably not happen, right? But while I was listening to your comments, I remembered another discussion I had while I was implementing a public engagement project with colleagues in India, and some of them came from science backgrounds, and I also happened to have a background in science. I wanted to become a mathematician before turning to the history of science, and I remember when I was going to what we used to call them national competitions in Romania, often competing with boys from my own school or other schools, that I wanted to be recognized on the same platform, on the main platform, right? Not on a separate platform, some sort of niche created especially for the recognition of women in science, right? And I think that's what we're trying to say with this book as well. And we talk about gender mainstreaming, and especially Andrea Petu, who contributed the last chapter. We talk about mainstreaming, gender and the histories of women in science. So this volume is just a beginning. Indeed, we have, separate volume case studies, but actually we hope that there will be no history of science that doesn't engage with these topics anymore in a much more integrated manner than what we achieved here. As to which stories resonated with me, it would be easy to say that those who are connected mostly to my own topic of research and geographical expertise, which is South Asia and East Asia. But I tried not to do this. I tried to challenge myself while working on this volume and learn more about women in STEM in other countries, including Central and Eastern Europe, that I'm ashamed to say I didn't know so much about. So, and this is why I hope that readers will approach the book in the same spirit, right? Not go first to the chapters they're most familiar with or the topics they're most familiar with, but use it as a way to challenge themselves and to read about other areas. And that, I hope, will be connected to innovative research topics, because we'll discover that indeed we can see connections, for example, between South Korea and Eastern Europe, something we learned while working on this book, in terms of policies about women in STEM that we didn't know about, and that's a topic that begs to be explored. So much more research should be done on that, and several other topics we discovered that I think. So I hope that's the future. As Katya said, is a polycentric history of science, in which we don't think anymore, about science as being transmitted, from the center, usually metropolitan center, to the peripheries, right? But it's something that's actually co-produced between different actors. Was there anything else that's so? I think I'll probably stop here for. Oh, and in terms of teaching, I really hope that we reach a blessed age in which the history of science will not be taught only to history students, right? But it will be taught in science faculties as well. And I personally am working hard towards integrating the sciences and the humanities. And I think, for me at least, that is one of the ways forward. I'll stop here, not to monopolize the discussion, and let Irina add her comments.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Rachel and Katya. Indeed, your observations are right to the point. And actually, these are exactly the questions that we asked ourselves when trying to figure out how to organize the volume and how to put together a narrative in the introductory part in order to engage with all the the chapters, which are very various, not only geographically, but also in terms of resources and topic and so on. And actually, this is a very good question, how we negotiated basically all those tensions. And this is how we came with the idea of negotiating, because it's something that you constantly negotiate also theoretically and epistemologically, not only within the actual case studies themselves. So this is how we came with the negotiation, because we found out that all these experiences are so varied, so diverse, but in the same time, there are these lines that you can recognize even in different ways, but throughout the, so, and I think these volumes really comes together, and it's kind of circular, because we have also individual case studies, but also collective case studies. We have the collective case studies with women doctors from China, and at the same time in parallel with women doctors in secondary school in Romania. These are very diverse geographic spaces, and still they somehow negotiate the same issues within the chapters. So basically, this is why the negotiation, and we negotiated ourselves, including with the authors when they needed to adapt also, and also indicated that they should also read the contributions of the other authors and respond to similar challenges. And it was very interesting. So the work itself taught us and the authors a lot. That's why like I try we try to focus on this. About women in STEM in the 21st century, as Amelia already mentioned, Andrea Peter's chapter actually makes a very good conclusion about this, not only about mainstreaming, but about the fact that we think that women have made a progress in this respect in the 20th century, but then we see that this progress is never truly won. It's something that we constantly, women and in general, women in science have to fight for this constantly. It's not like something it's not something like they win a place in the history of science and then they are there and it's something acknowledged. No, they constantly need to push in this direction. And we see how it's happening with politics nowadays, throughout the world, especially in this part of the world, with, I don't know, very conservative trends and right-wing populism, which tries to basically took away all these winnings that that women managed to. So I think, like Amelia said, that it's very important to continue on this line of analysis and actually teaching. This is very important. And I was very surprised when we have had a book launch of this a book in Bucharest. Some of the students from the Faculty of Political Science in Bucharest and also from the Faculty of Foreign Languages came, and they were really interested, and they came at the end to tell us nobody told us about history of science, about history of women in this way as you presented in this book. Why didn't we have this narrative before? We are interested, we want to read more about this. So basically, we need to give those students access to this kind of literature first. And then the second thing is archives, because is this like most of the historians say, well, women are not in history because they are not in the archives. But actually, for example, the chapter about women doctors in secondary schools in Romania show very clearly that there are a lot of documents created by these women, which are actually an act of resistance. Those women wanted to be integrated in this system, but the system pushed them away. But you find this resistance there in the archives. You just need to look for it. So basically, as a historian of science and of women, you need to go back to the archives and look better, not take all the already written histories and take them for granted. That would be. So maybe I will choose as my favorite chapter also because it's about Romania, that specific chapter on Romanian doctors in the secondary high schools in Romania. And I think I tried to answer everything. Just a small word about politics, because indeed politics is trying sometimes to grant more access to women in science, but it's not only about politics and legislation. We see that women have a specific quota in order to, it's how it's implemented and how these power structures actually, and people who are actually in power in institutions in the field are actually implementing or not those legislations. So it's not just enough to have the politics supporting you, it just, it has to be mainstream, as we already, yes, already said. So I think I'll stop here now.
Thank you. Thank you. Katya and Rachel, would you like to react to the interventions?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing, your favorite parts, the things that really resonated with you. The point about integration of I find this subject fascinating. I'm a basic scientist, cancer researcher, but I am absolutely convinced around the fundamental, foundational knowledge that this should be integrated into the training of all scientists. This type of information, this history should be there. So at Manchester, we've been trying to do this. We've created a unit called EDI, Your Role in Shaping a Fairer World. It was requested by the students. It's interdisciplinary, and it goes into an historical context as well. Ask students to take archives from the past and say what it means in terms of equality, diversity today and what it means to them. And one of the modules within that unit is EDI in research and innovation. So, and I can see so much of this content would absolutely enrich that curriculum, and the students really love it. And so I think there's an appetite. I think it's around, sharing this type of content with our students, and they will demand this type of curriculum for themselves, I think, even if some of our leaders may be less persuaded.
I thank you for sharing your ideas about this and your feedback to our ideas on it. I think there are two things I would like to say something about. It's what Irina said about the archives, and I can only agree with you. That actually we only have to go and look. Yeah, this idea of fragmented archive and of silenced women, I fully agree with you. Maybe we need to look closer, and maybe it takes a bit longer, but their documents are there, the sources are there. And for example, for my case of studying the history, the gendered history of science in Central Asia, we have these, as we call them, these private fonts, and we found like 2 giant private fonts of women we have never heard of before, and it's there. It's just that no one has ever looked at it, which actually leads me to the second thing you said about your students when you discussed your book in Bucharest with them, and how they were so fascinated and amazed. And it really warmed my heart to, I don't know, I guess we all as teachers, it warms our heart if we feel that what we're doing, it actually reaches the students, and it makes them think, and it makes them want to know more, right? And I was wondering, because in Central Asia, it's a little bit similar. Yeah, it's also a former communist regime. And so basically the idea of women in science is sort of taken for granted. Yeah, the so-called gender parity and equality. And there's the same. Until our project arrived 2 years ago, there are no other scholars. We found partners who work with us on these topics, but for them it's also because they're just curious. They have never worked on gendered science before, so it's really also something they're interested in, but because it has never been touched before, right? Because the women question was solved, or was sort of considered as being solved, and was wondering if maybe there's a link between your Bucharest students and my colleagues and our students in Central Asia. And I think, there's still a lot of work to do, and I think it's great to have books like that and that really are accessible to them.
Thank you very much. I would like also to bring to have a question about the concept of invisibility, and to build on what Katya and Irina just mentioned. So on one hand, we saw together, we discovered that invisibility, it's determined by fragmentation of power. I guess it can be also, and it might, you can name it as created through epistemology. It's determined by networks and the dynamic of networks, the geographical focus, empire, so-called peripheries, local, national, and so on. But I would like to also put a bit on emphasis on the invisibility or visibility of the archives, because here I do believe that's the central core of one of the central cores of our discussion, which is stated on page 13, and that's one point that really struck me and I reflected over. And my question is for both Irina and Amelia, and for our listeners, so the young scholars that you had in the public, right, and that would like to endeavor into this direction, to this topic. What would be the toolkit? What would be the methods that you would recommend? Already Katya mentioned, right? So to work private funds might be a good direction to start from. To look through different ways of reading through these archives. But as this school of thought or this change might be broad, what takeaways would be from the methodological perspective? What would you recommend to a young researcher that would be interested to go into this topic? And the second question is, as Katya mentioned, to what extent, how can we solve this conundrum of going beyond the case studies and to build a broader claim? And on this note, what are the unsolved questions in this book and the next questions that you would like to tackle?
Shall I start then? Is
Yes,
it okay?
yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to add something that has been on my mind about archives since listening to Katya's comment, and that is that indeed it is often the case that we have to look harder into the archives, and that's, I think, a point we made in the book. But depending on the actual context we're talking about, and especially if we're talking about colonial context like South Asia, it might be the case that there are no archives. So this can happen as well, especially if we're talking about institutional archives. And there is some very good research by South Asian historians on this topic, how often the institutional archives themselves are missing, which means the institutional archives of science, right? Which means that the chances of finding women in science are even lower, right? So in that case, and connecting this now to the methodology, something that I have worked on with a colleague of mine who is a historian of East Asia, Aya Homan, we realized that in many cases we actually need to try to build archives from scratch, and that's also another strategy, for the 75-year plan, right? We need to do our best to build better archives for women in STEM, so that the historians of the future can actually have better historical records, let's call them this way, so not only printed text, but other, forms of media to work with. And in this context, for us, what we have been planning to do is really to implement oral history interviews. So that's one methodology that I can recommend. And of course, it depends on the period of time we are talking about. So we won't be able to go back to the 19th century to conduct oral history interviews, but it is possible when other types of historical archives are missing to create interviews with scientists. And there are again some very good examples in South Asia. There are some very good examples in Japan. Such interviews have been created since the end of the 19th century, something I discovered while I was doing research and published, for example, in Japanese periodicals. Right, so we have small databases, say 5 interviews with not necessarily women in science, but women's experiences, right, in late 19th century Japan. So there's another important point that we shouldn't assume that it this hasn't been implemented, in Europe. It didn't happen in other parts of the world because it actually did, right? So there's a longer tradition of implementing this kind of research methodology. So that's one method that I think is important to focus on. Irina, did you want to add anything to the methodology?
Yes, actually, what Katia said about private funds and the question of Adrian about archives, it's vital. And I always try to explain to the students that when they are reading archives and materials, historical materials, they always need to take into consideration who produces that materials and which is the purpose. Because in the first stages of research, students have the tendency of believing official archives. But of course, those official archives are created with a purpose by a specific institution, mostly state institutions and so on. So I indeed think that students and we ourselves are as researchers need to search for alternative archives, and private funds are actually one of the archives that I like the most to work with in most of my researches, not only in this about women in science, but also like I know that Amelia worked with photos, and I myself when writing about another research that I did recently about the polydin vaccine, it was very interesting because all the official accounts were stating the men who worked in developing those vaccines. But then when you see all the photos in the media articles, there are a lot of women, most of the time, more women than men. And then if you go further into those photos and try to find out who those women were, then you find who actually contributed more to that, development. So that would be the methodological, especially to question who produces the archive and why and in which context, and to try to look for alternative like photos, media, private funds, I don't know, oral histories like Amelia very nicely said, and which is still at the beginning in this space. And about unsolved question and next questions, yes, I think this is a good line of going further with such a topic, like discussing about the archives. And actually me and Amelia discussed about doing something on the archives of women in science specifically.
Thank you very much. I would like to end with a quote from page 3. The invisibility of women in the 20th century, science, engineering, and medicine was context-specific and layered. Put differently, it was shaped by a host of intersecting factors, like gender, race, ethnicity, class, caste, religion, marital status, sexuality, age, urban-rural divides, and so on, that played out differently in different geographical and temporal contexts. To borrow Anna Meinhardt's a beautiful metaphor, in her discussion of women writers in the 20th century Hungary, women's engagement with science in the 20th century appeared to be, I quote, both hidden and hiding itself away in the manner of a sinking stream which comes to the surface only to vanish underground again. I end the quote. Dear listeners, in case the arguments and the cases presented convinced you, do not forget to check the open access link available on our webpage and on the publisher's website. Let us keep in touch. Please subscribe, if you have not done already so, to our media channels for more information about our regular events. Stay tuned.